You know what they say about sleeping with the enemy? Well, I've been sleeping with cockroaches for 3 months now, and let me tell you something that might shock you more than finding me. A 72-year-old woman curled up on a moldy mattress in a crawlspace beneath what used to be my own home. The real shock isn't that my son David put me here. The real shock is what he never knew about the woman he shoved into this dark, damp hell beneath his feet. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Pamela Griffin, but everyone's always called me Pam. And right now, as I speak to you from this godforsaken place where the walls weep moisture and creatures scurry past my head at night, I want you to understand something. This isn't just another story about family dysfunction or elder abuse, though God knows it's both of those things. This is about the most expensive lesson in humility that any son has ever received, and he doesn't even know the bill is coming due. The smell hits you first. It's a cocktail of mildew, rotting wood, and something else I prefer not to identify, mixed with the metallic tang of rusted pipes that haven't seen maintenance in decades. The ceiling above my head is so low that if I sit up too quickly, I scrape my scalp against the rough wooden beams. I learned that lesson the hard way during my first week down here, when the shock of my new reality hadn't quite settled in yet. I'm lying on what David generously calls my bed, a twin mattress so thin and worn that every spring pokes through like accusatory fingers, reminding me with each movement how far I've fallen. The mattress sits directly on the concrete foundation, and the cold seeps through the inadequate padding and into my arthritic bones with a persistence that makes sleep almost impossible. Almost. Exhaustion, I've discovered, can override even the most uncomfortable circumstances. The cockroaches don't bother announcing themselves anymore. In the beginning, I used to jolt awake every time I felt those tiny legs skittering across my arm or face. Now, 3 months into this nightmare, I barely flinch when one of them decides to use me as a highway. I've learned to coexist with them in ways I never imagined possible. There's a particularly large one I've named Herbert, who seems to have claimed the area near my pillow as his territory. We've reached an understanding, Herbert and I. He keeps to his corner, and I try not to roll over onto his family. The single, bare bulb that dangles from a wire above my sleeping area flickers intermittently, casting dancing shadows that make the crawlspace feel even more like a tomb. David installed it himself after I complained about the darkness, and I suspect he chose the cheapest, most unreliable fixture he could find. It's his way of saying he's providing for me while making sure I understand exactly how little I deserve. Water drips constantly from somewhere I can't identify, creating a rhythm that might be soothing under different circumstances. Drip, drip, drip. It's become the soundtrack to my new existence, marking time in a place where day and night blur together into one continuous stretch of humid misery. The sound echoes off the concrete walls and amplifies in the enclosed space, sometimes so loudly that it drowns out the conversations happening in the house above my head. And oh, the conversations I hear. The walls and floors of this old house aren't nearly thick enough to muffle the sounds of life continuing without me just a few feet above where I lie. I hear David's friends laughing, their voices carrying down through the heating vents as they enjoy the hospitality of what was once my home. I hear the television programs I used to watch, the familiar sounds of game shows and evening news that now seem like transmissions from another world entirely. The worst part isn't the physical discomfort, though that's considerable. The worst part is the psychological warfare that comes with being forgotten while still being present. David has friends over at least 3 times a week, and I can hear them commenting on the house, complimenting the renovations he's made with money that came from sources they'll never suspect. They admire the new leather furniture in the living room, the state-of-the-art entertainment system, the gourmet kitchen appliances that David uses to host dinner parties I'm not invited to attend. Your mom really hooked you up with this place, I heard one of them say last week. The irony of that statement was so sharp it could have cut glass. Yeah, well, she's taken care of, David replied. and I could hear the dismissive shrug in his voice. She's got everything she needs. Everything I need. A moldy mattress, a flickering light bulb, and the constant company of insects. If that's everything I need, then I've been living far too luxuriously for the past 72 years. The toilet situation is perhaps the most degrading aspect of this entire arrangement. David installed what he calls a camping toilet, essentially a bucket with a seat, in the far corner of the crawlspace. It's positioned behind a makeshift curtain made from an old shower liner, which provides the illusion of privacy while doing nothing to contain the smell. I empty it myself twice a day, climbing the wooden ladder that leads to the kitchen door and carrying my waist up like some medieval servant, hoping none of David's friends happen to be visiting when I make these humiliating trips. The ladder itself is another cruel joke. David built it himself, and either his carpentry skills are severely lacking, or he designed it specifically to make my life more difficult. The rungs are uneven, some higher than others, and the whole structure wobbles with every step. My hands, gnarled with arthritis and weakened by age, can barely maintain their grip on the rough wood. I've fallen twice, once badly enough to bruise my entire left side from hip to shoulder. David's response when I told him about the fall was to suggest I should be more careful. Food arrives on a schedule that seems designed more for David's convenience than my nutrition. Usually, it's leftovers from whatever he's prepared for himself and his friends, delivered on paper plates that he lowers down on a rope rather than making the trip down the ladder himself. Sometimes it's a sandwich, sometimes it's the remainder of a pizza. Occasionally, it's nothing more than crackers and whatever lunch meat is approaching its expiration date. The portions are small enough that I'm constantly hungry, but large enough that David can tell himself he's fulfilling his obligation to keep me alive. I've lost nearly 30 pounds since moving down here, and my clothes hang on my frame like drapery on a too-small mannequin. The weight loss isn't entirely due to the meager food portions, though those certainly contribute. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It's also the result of stress, depression, and the constant low-level nausea that comes from living in such conditions. My stomach has adapted to expect less, and sometimes I find myself saving half of whatever meal David provides, not because I'm not hungry, but because I've learned not to trust that the next meal will arrive on schedule. The isolation is perhaps more devastating than the physical hardships. I haven't had a real conversation with another human being in months. David's interactions with me are limited to the absolute minimum necessary to maintain the pretense that he's caring for me. He'll call down occasionally to ask if I'm still alive down there, and his tone makes it clear that either answer would be acceptable to him. Sometimes he'll inform me about practical matters, that he's having the house fumigated and I need to stay in the crawlspace for an extra day, that he'll be out of town and I shouldn't expect food deliveries, that his girlfriend will be staying over and I need to keep quiet. His girlfriend. That's another layer of humiliation I hadn't anticipated. Jessica is 28 years old, barely older than David was when I was working 3 jobs to put him through college. She has no idea I exist, as far as I can tell, and David intends to keep it that way. On the nights she sleeps over, I have to lie perfectly still and silent, listening to their conversations, their laughter, their intimacy taking place in rooms I used to call my own. Jessica compliments David on his independence, his success, his beautiful home. She tells him how mature he is, how together he has his life, how different he is from other men his age who still rely on their parents. The irony is so thick I can taste it, metallic and bitter like blood. But here's the thing about irony. It cuts both ways. And while David is upstairs accepting praise for achievements that aren't his, for independence that's an illusion, for success that's built on a foundation he's never bothered to examine, I'm down here in the dark, remembering things I've spent years trying to forget. Remembering who I really am beneath the persona of the helpless elderly mother he's convinced himself I've always been. The concrete floor beneath my mattress is cold and unforgiving, but it's also solid, reliable, permanent. Like certain truths that don't change no matter how deeply they're buried or how long they're ignored. I press my palm against that concrete sometimes, feeling its substance, its reality, and I remind myself that foundations matter. They determine what can be built on top of them, and they determine what happens when the weight above becomes too much to bear. I've been thinking a lot about foundations lately, about the foundation of this house, which I paid for with cash in 1987 when David was still in high school, about the foundation of David's life, which has been built on assumptions and half-truths, and a carefully maintained ignorance about where his opportunities really came from. About the foundation of my own identity, which I've kept hidden for so long that sometimes I almost forget it myself. The house directly above me is worth approximately $2 million now, thanks to the neighborhood's gentrification and the improvements David has made using funds he believes come from my modest retirement savings and Social Security. He's never questioned how a woman who worked as a secretary and a part-time bookkeeper for most of her adult life managed to accumulate enough wealth to buy a house outright, pay for his college education, and continue to provide him with a comfortable lifestyle well into his 30s. David has never been curious about money, which is perhaps the most ironic thing of all. He's never wondered why the checks never stopped coming, why there was always enough for whatever he needed, why emergencies never created financial stress in our household the way they did for his friends' families. He accepted abundance as his natural state, the way children accept sunshine and air, as something that simply exists without requiring explanation or gratitude. I enabled this attitude, I'll admit. I wanted him to feel secure, to never experience the financial anxiety that had dominated my own childhood. I wanted him to be free to pursue his dreams without the weight of economic worry crushing his aspirations before they could take flight. I thought I was giving him a gift. I thought I was being a good mother. But somewhere along the way, security became entitlement. Freedom from financial worry became freedom from financial responsibility. The gift I thought I was giving became a curse I was too proud and too loving to recognize until it was far too late to correct course without destroying everything I'd worked to build. The psychological manipulation started so gradually that I didn't recognize it as manipulation at all. It began with small suggestions that I was becoming forgetful, that I was having trouble managing my affairs, that I needed more help than I was willing to admit. David would point out instances where I'd misplaced my keys or forgotten an appointment, and he'd frame his concern in language that sounded caring, but carried an undertone of condescension that grew stronger with each conversation. "Mom, you're not as young as you used to be," became his standard refrain. "You need to start thinking about what's practical." What was practical, according to David, was giving him power of attorney over my financial affairs. What was practical was putting the house in his name to simplify things when I was gone. What was practical was letting him handle the bills, the taxes, the investments, all the tedious paperwork that was becoming too much for someone my age to manage effectively. I resisted at first, but David was persistent and patient. He framed every conversation in terms of my well-being, my security, my peace of mind. He brought me articles about elderly people who'd been scammed or who'd made poor financial decisions due to declining cognitive function. He introduced me to friends whose parents had faced similar challenges and who'd benefited from their children's intervention. The campaign was so subtle, so loving in its presentation, that I began to doubt my own perceptions. Maybe I was becoming forgetful. Maybe I was making mistakes I wasn't aware of. Maybe David's concern was justified, and my resistance was just stubbornness disguised as independence. The transition of power happened in stages, each one seeming reasonable in isolation, but devastating in combination. First, David took over paying the bills, ostensibly to save me the trouble of writing checks and keeping track of due dates. Then he assumed responsibility for filing my taxes, claiming his business degree made him better qualified to handle the complexities of my financial situation. Then he suggested we consolidate my various accounts to make management easier, transferring everything into accounts where he was listed as a joint owner. Each step felt like a small concession to practicality, but together they created a web that trapped me as effectively as any physical prison. By the time I realized what had happened, David controlled every aspect of my financial life, and I was dependent on his goodwill for everything from grocery money to prescription medications. The emotional manipulation was even more insidious than the financial control. David became an expert at weaponizing guilt, framing every disagreement as evidence of my ingratitude for everything he was doing for me. When I complained about losing my independence, he reminded me of all the ways he was sacrificing his own time and energy to care for me. When I suggested I could still handle certain responsibilities myself, he expressed hurt that I didn't trust him or appreciate his efforts. "I'm trying to help you, Mom," he would say with a wounded expression that made me feel cruel for questioning his motives. "I'm doing everything I can to make your life easier, and all you do is fight me." The guilt was crushing. Here was my son, my only child, the person I'd devoted my life to raising and supporting, and he was presenting himself as my selfless caregiver, while I was cast in the role of the ungrateful, difficult elderly parent who couldn't appreciate the sacrifices being made on her behalf. The narrative was so compelling, so emotionally manipulative, that I began to internalize it myself. Maybe I was being ungrateful. Maybe I was being difficult. Maybe David's increasing frustration with me was justified, and I was the problem in our relationship. The physical decline of my living situation happened gradually enough that each step seemed like a temporary adjustment rather than a permanent degradation. First, David suggested I might be more comfortable in the smaller bedroom, since the master suite was too much space for one person and might be making me feel lonely. The smaller bedroom had a single bed instead of the queen-size mattress I'd slept on for decades, but David assured me it would be cozier. Then he decided the smaller bedroom would make a better office for his growing business, and wouldn't I be more comfortable in the converted basement room? It had its own bathroom, he pointed out, and it would give me more privacy. The basement room was darker and damper than anywhere I'd ever lived, but David painted it as an upgrade, a private apartment within the larger house where I could have my independence while still being close enough for him to help when I needed it. The final move to the Crawlspace was presented as a temporary necessity, while David renovated the basement room to make it more suitable for my needs. The renovation has been ongoing for 3 months now, though I haven't heard any construction, sounds, or seen any evidence of work being done. I suspect the renovation is as fictional as David's concern for my comfort, but I no longer have the power to challenge his decisions about my living arrangements. The Crawlspace was never intended for human habitation, and every aspect of my current situation reflects that fundamental inappropriateness. The ceiling is too low for me to stand upright. The ventilation is inadequate, creating a constantly humid environment that exacerbates my arthritis and makes breathing difficult. The insulation is old and deteriorating, releasing fibers into the air that make me cough and irritate my skin. The electrical system consists of a single outlet and the flickering overhead bulb, providing just enough power for the most basic needs while making any real comfort impossible. But perhaps the most telling detail about my current living situation is that David installed a lock on the door at the top of the ladder. He claims it's for my security, to prevent intruders from accessing the house through the crawlspace entrance. The lock, however, is on the outside of the door, accessible only from the kitchen. I am not securing myself in. I am being secured down here by someone else's choice. The lock represents the final transformation of my role from resident to prisoner, from mother to burden, from person to problem, to be managed and contained. David doesn't call it imprisonment because he provides food and acknowledges my existence when absolutely necessary. He doesn't call it abuse because he's not hitting me or screaming at me or threatening me with violence. He calls it care And perhaps that's the most insidious aspect of the entire situation. In David's version of reality, he's the sacrificial son caring for his aging, difficult mother. He's making hard choices about my living situation based on practical considerations and financial constraints. He's doing his best with limited resources and a parent who doesn't appreciate his efforts. He's the hero of this story, and I'm the burden he bears with admirable grace and patience. But stories have a way of revealing their true nature over time, and the version of events David has constructed for himself and others is built on a foundation of lies so elaborate and so complete that the truth, when it finally emerges, will reshape everything he thinks he knows about his life, his success, and his relationship with the woman currently lying on a moldy mattress in the crawlspace beneath his feet. Because here's what David doesn't know, what he's never bothered to learn, what his assumptions and his entitlement and his carefully maintained ignorance have hidden from him for decades. The woman he's treating like a discarded piece of furniture. The woman he's convinced himself is a financial burden who should be grateful for his minimal care. The woman whose identity he's reduced to aging mother who needs to be managed. That woman is worth more money than he could spend in several lifetimes. That woman is Pamela Griffin. And Pamela Griffin is not who David thinks she is. Not even close. But that revelation is still coming. For now, I lie here in the dark, listening to the sounds of my son living a life built on my foundation while treating me like the crawlspace pest I've been reduced to. I lie here and I remember who I really am. And I make plans that David, in his arrogance and his ignorance, will never see coming. The cockroaches and I have become quite companionable during these long months. Herbert, in particular, has become almost a confidant. I tell him things I haven't told another living soul in years. I tell him about the choices I made and the prices I paid and the identity I buried so deep that sometimes I almost forget it myself. Herbert listens without judgment, which is more than I can say for my son, and in the spaces between the dripping water and the creaking floorboards above, in the moments when David's laughter drifts down through the heating vents like a taunt, I make decisions that will change everything. I make plans that will transform this nightmare into the most expensive lesson in humility and respect that any ungrateful child has ever received. The foundation beneath me is solid concrete, poured decades ago to last for generations. It's reliable, unchanging, permanent. Like certain truths that don't disappear just because they've been forgotten or ignored. Like certain identities that don't cease to exist just because they've been hidden or denied. David thinks he knows everything about foundations. He's made improvements to this house, upgraded systems, renovated rooms, all built on the solid base that was here long before he arrived. But he's never bothered to examine that foundation closely. Never wondered about its composition or its source or its true capacity to support the weight of everything built upon it. That's about to change. Because foundations, as David is going to learn, can shift. And when they do, everything built on top of them shifts too. Sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once, but always with consequences that reach far beyond what anyone expects or prepares for. The lesson is coming, and it's going to be worth every penny. The memories come in waves now, triggered by the strangest things. Yesterday, it was the sound of David's espresso machine grinding beans in the kitchen above me. The mechanical whir transported me back to 1989, when I first walked into the corporate headquarters of Meridian Financial Group and heard that same sound emanating from the executive break room. I was 26 years old, newly divorced, and carrying a 3-year-old David on my hip because I couldn't afford childcare for the job interview. I remember standing in that marble lobby, feeling completely out of place in my discount department, store suit, watching women in designer clothing glide past me like they belonged in a different species entirely. The receptionist looked at me with barely concealed disdain when I explained I was there for the secretarial position, her eyes lingering on David's juice-stained shirt and my scuffed shoes. What none of them knew What I couldn't tell them was that I had been groomed for a very different kind of life. A life that had been ripped away from me so completely that sometimes I wondered if I had imagined it entirely. But lying here in this crawl space, with nothing but time and regret, for company, I find myself remembering details I thought I had buried forever. My maiden name was Pamela Whitmore, and the Whitmore family owned approximately 60% of the largest shipping conglomerate on the East Coast. We weren't just wealthy, we were generationally, dynastically wealthy. Old money in the truest sense, with roots that stretched back to the Industrial Revolution and tentacles that reached into every major business sector you could imagine. My great-great-grandfather had started with a single cargo ship and built an empire that, by the time I was born, controlled trade routes that connected every major port in the Atlantic. I was raised in a world where money was never discussed because it was never a concern. We had staff who had staff. We owned homes I visited maybe twice in my entire childhood. My mother's jewelry collection was worth more than most people's houses, and she considered it modest compared to her friends' collections. I attended boarding schools where the annual tuition exceeded what most families earned in a year, and I thought that was normal. The plan for my life was as predetermined as the sunrise. I would attend the appropriate preparatory schools, then an Ivy League university where I would major in something sufficiently impressive, but not too practical. Art history, perhaps, or comparative literature. I would marry someone from an equivalent family, someone whose bloodline and bank account complemented our own. I would produce the next generation of Whitmore heirs and spend my adult life managing charitable foundations and attending social events that existed primarily to consolidate power among people who already had more than they could ever use. It was a comfortable plan, a predictable plan, and I followed it dutifully through my teenage years. I excelled at the things wealthy young women were expected to excel at. I spoke 3 languages fluently, played piano and violin, rode horses, competitively, and could navigate a formal dinner party with the kind of effortless grace that only comes from a lifetime of practice. I was, by every measure that mattered in my world, a success. But I was also curious about the world beyond the insulated bubble of extreme wealth, and that curiosity would eventually destroy everything I thought I knew about my life. During my junior year at Vassar, I started volunteering at a community center in a working-class neighborhood about 20 minutes from campus. It was supposed to be a brief charitable commitment, something impressive to put on graduate school applications. But it became something much more significant than that. For the first time in my life, I was interacting with people who worked multiple jobs to pay rent, who worried about grocery money, who made real sacrifices to ensure their children had opportunities they themselves had never enjoyed. I met Thomas Griffin at that community center. He was teaching a literacy program for adult learners, and he approached his work with a passion and dedication that was completely foreign to my experience. Thomas cared about things that mattered. He believed education could change lives, that every person deserved dignity and opportunity regardless of their economic circumstances. He worked 60 hours a week at the community center and took home barely enough money to cover his own modest expenses. But he was happier and more fulfilled than anyone I had ever known. Thomas was everything my family would disapprove of, and that made him irresistible to me. He came from a middle-class background, had worked his way through state college on academic scholarships, and believed that a person's worth was determined by their character rather than their bank account. He treated me like I was interesting and intelligent, not because of my family connections, but because of my thoughts and opinions and dreams. When I told him about my background, about the wealth and the expectations and the predetermined path my life was supposed to follow, Thomas listened without judgment, but also without the fawning deference I was accustomed to receiving. He wasn't impressed by money he had never seen, and he wasn't intimidated by a world he had no desire to enter. He saw me as Pamela, not as a Whitmore heir, and that was intoxicating. We fell in love the way young people do when they believe love can conquer any obstacle. We made plans that ignored practical realities and promises that we had no idea how to keep. When Thomas proposed during my senior year, offering me a simple gold band that probably cost him 2 months' salary, I said yes, without considering the consequences or the catastrophic family crisis that would inevitably follow. My parents' reaction was swift and absolute. They didn't rage or threaten or even express disappointment. They simply cut me off completely, as cleanly and efficiently as a surgeon removing a tumor. The trust funds were revoked, the credit cards were canceled, and my name was removed from all family documents. I was given 72 hours to remove my personal belongings from the family home, and I was informed that any attempt to contact family members or family businesses would result in legal action. The speed and completeness of my excommunication was breathtaking. Within a week, I went from being worth hundreds of millions of dollars to owning nothing but whatever I could fit in Thomas's aging Honda Civic. The transition was so abrupt and so total that I felt like I was living in someone else's life, playing a role in a story I didn't understand. Thomas tried to comfort me, tried to convince me that we would build our own life together, that we didn't need my family's money or approval to be happy. And for a while, we almost managed to make that true. We moved to a small apartment in a neighborhood where the rent consumed most of Thomas's income. I learned to shop at discount grocery stores and clip coupons and stretch every dollar until it screamed. I discovered that I actually enjoyed the challenge of creating a life from nothing, of proving to myself that I could survive without the safety net I had always taken for granted. But poverty, I learned, is more than just having less money. It's a constant state of anxiety about things that wealthy people never have to consider. It's worrying about whether you can afford to fix your car when it breaks down, or whether you should skip a meal so your child can have seconds. It's making decisions based on cost rather than preference, and it's watching opportunities slip away because you can't afford to take advantage of them. When I became pregnant with David, the financial stress became overwhelming. Thomas was working longer hours at the community center while also taking on weekend jobs to increase our income, but we were barely staying afloat even with his exhausting schedule. The pregnancy was difficult, requiring several expensive medical appointments that we couldn't afford but couldn't postpone. I spent my 3rd trimester lying awake at night, calculating and recalculating our finances, trying to figure out how we were going to provide for a baby when we could barely provide for ourselves. David was born on a Tuesday morning in October, and he was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, a healthy cry that announced his arrival to the world with impressive volume. But he was also expensive in ways that no amount of preparation could have anticipated. The hospital bills, the pediatrician visits, the diapers and formula and clothing that he outgrew every few weeks. The costs accumulated faster than our ability to pay them. Thomas took on a 3rd job, delivering pizza in the evenings after his community center work was finished. He would come home exhausted and smelling like cheese and marinara sauce, collapse into our second-hand recliner for a few hours of sleep, then get up and do it all again. I could see the stress wearing him down, aging him in ways that should have taken decades rather than months. I tried to contribute financially, taking on freelance bookkeeping work that I could do from home while caring for David. My education had prepared me for a life of leisure, not practical employment, but I discovered I had a natural aptitude for numbers and organization. The work was tedious but steady, and every check helped us stay one step ahead of financial disaster. But the pressure of constant financial worry was taking a toll on our marriage. Thomas became irritable and distant, worn down by the relentless demands of trying to support a family on inadequate income. We argued about money constantly, about whether we could afford things as basic as new shoes or a night out for dinner. The love that had seemed so powerful and enduring during our college years began to feel fragile under the weight of practical concerns. The breaking point came when David was 18 months old. Thomas had been working 7 days a week for months, trying to save enough money for us to move to a better apartment in a safer neighborhood. He fell asleep at the wheel driving home from his pizza delivery job and crashed into a tree less than 2 miles from our home. The accident wasn't severe enough to kill him, but it was serious enough to leave him with chronic back pain and medical bills that dwarfed anything we had faced before. Thomas couldn't work the same demanding schedule with his injured back, which meant our already precarious finances became completely untenable. We fell behind on rent, behind on utilities, behind on everything. The stress of watching our life fall apart was destroying what remained of our marriage, and both of us knew it, even though neither of us was willing to admit it out loud. The divorce was as quiet and civilized as our financial situation would allow. Thomas moved back in with his parents, and I found myself alone with a toddler in an apartment I couldn't afford, with no family to turn to and no safety net except whatever I could create for myself. The Whitmore money was still out there, still generating returns and funding the lifestyles of people who shared my DNA but no longer claimed me as family, but it might as well have been on the moon for all the good it did me. I took the job at Meridian Financial Group out of desperation rather than ambition. The pay was decent enough to cover our basic expenses, and they offered health insurance that would cover David's pediatric care. The work itself was mind-numbing, filing documents and answering phones and managing calendars for executives who earned more in a month than I would see in a year. But it was stable employment, and stability was more valuable to me than anything else at that point in my life. What I didn't expect was how good I would be at the work and how quickly I would advance within the company. My upbringing had given me an understanding of business and finance that most people in my position lacked. I could read annual reports and understand market analyses and anticipate the kinds of information executives would need before they asked for it. My education, which had seemed useless in my daily struggle to survive, suddenly became a tremendous asset in a corporate environment. Within 2 years, I was promoted from secretary to administrative assistant. Within 5 years, I was managing the schedules and correspondence for 3 senior vice presidents. My salary increased steadily, and for the first time since leaving my family, I began to feel like David and I might actually have a future that extended beyond mere survival. But the most significant development during my years at Meridian wasn't professional advancement. It was the gradual realization that I had access to information that could be extraordinarily valuable to someone who understood how to use it. I was scheduling meetings between executives and regulatory officials, typing correspondence about mergers and acquisitions, filing documents that contained details about corporate strategies that wouldn't be public knowledge for months. I wasn't looking for opportunities to profit from insider information. The access developed so gradually, and my understanding of its potential value emerged so slowly that I never made a conscious decision to become what I eventually became. But I was intelligent, I was observant, and I was desperate to build a better life for my son than the one I was currently able to provide. The first investment I made using information I had gleaned from my work was small and cautious. I overheard a conversation about a pharmaceutical company that was about to receive FDA approval for a breakthrough medication, and I used $500 from my savings account to buy stock in that company. When the approval was announced, 6 weeks later, my investment tripled in value. That first success was intoxicating, but it was also terrifying. I knew I was crossing ethical lines that could result in criminal charges if I was discovered. But I also knew that David and I were living paycheck to paycheck in a neighborhood where I worried about his safety every time he left the apartment. The money from that first investment allowed me to move us to a better area, to enroll David in a preschool program that would give him advantages I couldn't provide on my own. I told myself I would stop after that one success, that I had gotten lucky and shouldn't push my luck any further. But the access to information continued, and the opportunities to profit from that information were constant. A merger here, an acquisition there, a regulatory decision that would affect stock prices, in predictable ways. I developed a system for making investments that were small enough to avoid attention, but frequent enough to generate significant returns over time. I was careful, methodical, and absolutely paranoid about covering my tracks. I opened investment accounts under different names, spread my trades across multiple brokerages, and never invested enough in any single opportunity to attract regulatory scrutiny. I studied the patterns of legitimate investors and mimicked their strategies to make my own activities appear routine and unremarkable. The money accumulated slowly at first, then with increasing speed as my investment capital grew and my understanding of market patterns deepened. By the time David started elementary school, I had accumulated enough wealth to buy our first house outright, paying cash to avoid the complications of mortgage applications and credit checks that might have revealed the sources of my newfound prosperity. But even as my financial situation improved dramatically, I maintained the lifestyle of a working single mother earning a secretary's salary. I continued working at Meridian, continued living modestly, continued making the kind of practical decisions that someone in my apparent circumstances would make. David attended public schools, wore clothing from discount retailers, and participated in free or low-cost activities available through community programs. The deception became so natural, so thoroughly integrated into our daily life, that sometimes I almost forgot it was a deception at all. I was Pam Griffin, hardworking single mother who was doing her best to provide for her son on limited resources. The fact that I had millions of dollars in investment accounts scattered across the country was a secret so well hidden that even I sometimes lost sight of its reality. The irony of my situation was not lost on me. I had been raised in a world of extreme wealth, rejected that world for love, lost everything when that love failed, and then rebuilt a fortune through methods that my family would have considered not just unethical, but beneath their dignity. I had become wealthy again, but in a way that was entirely separate from the Whitmore legacy and the expectations that had once defined my life. As David grew older, I began to invest not just in stocks and bonds, but in his future. I established education funds that would ensure he could attend any college he chose without the financial stress that had complicated my own young adulthood. I purchased properties that would provide rental income and long-term security. I diversified my investments across international markets and alternative assets, building a portfolio that could sustain multiple generations of comfortable living. But I never told David about any of it. I wanted him to develop his own work, ethic, his own sense of responsibility, his own appreciation for the value of money and effort. I had seen what inherited wealth could do to a person's character, how it could create entitlement and laziness and a fundamental disconnection from the realities that most people face. I wanted David to be different, to be better, to be the kind of person who would use advantages responsibly rather than taking them for granted. So I maintained the fiction of our modest circumstances while secretly ensuring that David's needs were always met and his opportunities were always available. When he needed equipment for school sports, I found ways to provide it that looked like careful budgeting rather than easy spending. When he wanted to attend summer camps or take music lessons, I made sacrifices that appeared significant but actually represented tiny fractions of my real financial capacity. I thought I was teaching him valuable lessons about work and responsibility and gratitude. I thought I was protecting him from the corrupting influence of unearned wealth while still ensuring he had every advantage I could provide. I thought I was being a good mother, balancing support with expectations in a way that would help him become a good man. But children learn more from what they observe than from what they're told, and what David observed was a mother who always managed to find money when he needed it, who never seemed to struggle with the kind of financial stress that affected his friends' families, who provided a level of stability and security that didn't match the modest lifestyle we appeared to be living. He learned to expect that his needs would be met without understanding the source of that security. He learned to take advantages for granted without appreciating the effort required to provide them. He learned that money was something that appeared when necessary, not something that had to be earned or managed or respected. By the time David reached high school, I could see that my strategy was backfiring. Instead of teaching him responsibility, I had taught him entitlement. Instead of helping him appreciate the value of work, I had shown him that his needs would be met regardless of his own efforts. Instead of preparing him to be independent, I had created a young man who expected support, without feeling obligated to reciprocate or even acknowledge the source of that support. But I loved him so much, and I wanted his life to be easier than mine had been. So I continued the deception even as I watched it shape him in ways I hadn't intended. When he graduated from high school, I paid for his college education in full, presenting it as the result of careful saving and small sacrifices, rather than the reality of my substantial wealth. When he struggled academically, I hired tutors and presented them as scholarships or community programs, rather than services I was purchasing privately. When David graduated from college and struggled to find employment that met his expectations, I created consulting work for him through business contacts I had developed over the years. The work was real and the pay was fair, but the opportunities were arranged rather than earned. David believed he was succeeding on his own merits, never questioning why doors seemed to open for him more easily than they did for his peers. As David moved into his 20s and then his 30s, the pattern continued and intensified. He lived in apartments that I owned, but he believed he was renting from independent landlords. He drove cars that I had purchased, but he thought he was buying with his own earnings and reasonable financing. He socialized with people who welcomed him partly because of business relationships they had with companies I controlled through various investment vehicles. The web of deception grew more complex every year, requiring increasing amounts of energy and creativity to maintain. But I was trapped in it as surely as David was benefiting from it. To reveal the truth would have required admitting years of lies, acknowledging that his entire adult life had been built on a foundation of parental support he had never recognized or appreciated. And so I continued the charade, even as I watched David become more demanding, more entitled, more convinced that his lifestyle was the result of his own capabilities rather than his mother's hidden generosity. I told myself that eventually I would find the right way to transition him toward independence, that I would gradually reduce my support and help him understand the reality of our situation. But eventually, never came, and David's expectations only grew larger and more expensive. He wanted a better apartment, a nicer car, more expensive vacations, a lifestyle that required constant financial input from sources he never examined or questioned. The requests for help became demands, the demands became assumptions, and the assumptions became entitlements that he defended with increasing anger whenever they were challenged. The psychological manipulation that eventually led to my current situation in this crawlspace didn't begin with malicious intent. It began with David's genuine belief that he was entitled to a lifestyle that his own earnings couldn't support, combined with his assumption that I had resources available to bridge the gap between his desires and his capabilities. When I began to express concerns about his spending and his lack of independence, David responded with confusion and hurt feelings rather than self-reflection. In his mind, I had always been able to provide whatever he needed, so my sudden reluctance to continue that support seemed arbitrary and cruel rather than financially necessary. He began to reframe our relationship in ways that painted him as the responsible party, and me as the burden that required management. I was getting older, he argued, and I was becoming forgetful and unreliable. I was making poor decisions about money and household management, and I needed his guidance to avoid serious mistakes that could jeopardize our security. The gaslighting was so gradual and so persistent that I began to doubt my own perceptions. Maybe I was becoming less capable than I wanted to admit. Maybe David's increasing control over my finances and living situation was necessary rather than manipulative. Maybe his frustration with me was justified, and I was being unreasonable in my resistance to his help. By the time I realized what was happening, David had assumed control over every aspect of my life, and I was dependent on his goodwill for everything from food to shelter to basic dignity. The transition from independent woman to managed dependent had happened so slowly that I hadn't recognized it until it was complete. And now I lie here in this crawl space, listening to David and his friends enjoy the fruits of wealth they don't know exists, while the woman who created that wealth is treated like a burden to be hidden away and minimally maintained. The irony is so complete, so perfectly circular, that it would be funny if it weren't so devastating. But memory is a powerful thing, and identity is not something that can be erased simply by changing circumstances. I may be lying on a moldy mattress surrounded by cockroaches, but I am still Pamela Griffin, and I still control assets worth more than David could comprehend, even if he were capable of counting that high. The lesson is coming, and it's going to be comprehensive. The coughing started 3 weeks ago, a dry hack that echoes off the concrete walls and seems to get worse every day. The mold spores floating through this space are taking their toll on my 72-year-old lungs, but David's response when I mentioned it was to suggest I should drink more water. As if hydration could counteract the effects of living in what amounts to a subterranean petri dish. This morning, I woke up to find my left ankle swollen to nearly twice its normal size. The combination of sleeping on concrete, the constant dampness, and my limited ability to move around has created circulation problems that I recognize as potentially serious. But when I called up to David through the heating vent, asking if he could take me to see a doctor, his reply was that I was probably just retaining water and should elevate my feet. Elevate my feet. In a space where I can't even sit up straight without hitting my head on the ceiling beams. The irony of receiving medical advice from someone whose own healthcare has been funded by my investments for the past 15 years is not lost on me. David's comprehensive health insurance, his dental work, his vision correction surgery, even his cosmetic procedures that he thinks I don't know about, all paid for through carefully orchestrated financial maneuvers that he's never bothered to question or investigate. But it's not just the physical deterioration that's wearing me down. It's the psychological assault of being forgotten while remaining present, of being reduced to a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected. Yesterday, I heard David on the phone with someone, laughing about how quiet his mother has become lately, how much easier she is to deal with now that she's settled into her new routine. Her new routine, as if choosing to live in a crawlspace surrounded by vermin and breathing toxic air was a lifestyle decision I made rather than a punishment imposed upon me. The breaking point came this afternoon, during what David apparently thought was a private conversation with his girlfriend Jessica. They were in the kitchen directly above my head, and their voices carried down through the floorboards with perfect clarity. Jessica was asking about me, wondering why she'd never met David's mother despite their relationship lasting several months. "Oh, she's around," David said with the casual dismissiveness of someone discussing a piece of furniture. "She keeps to herself mostly. You know how old people can be, kind of set in their ways, prefer their own space." "But don't you think she'd like to meet me?" Jessica pressed. "I mean, I'm practically living here half the time. It seems weird that we've never even said hello." There was a pause, and I could picture David searching for an explanation that would satisfy Jessica's curiosity without revealing the truth about my living situation. When he spoke again, his tone carried a note of manufactured sadness that made my stomach turn. "The thing is, Jess, Mom's not really. She's not really herself anymore, if you know what I mean. She gets confused sometimes, forgets things, says inappropriate stuff. It's better for everyone if she has her privacy and doesn't get overwhelmed by too much social interaction." Jessica's response was a soft murmur of sympathy, followed by the sound of her comforting David for the difficult situation he was dealing with. I lay there listening to my son accept condolences for the burden of caring for his mentally declining mother, while that same mother was imprisoned beneath his feet with her mind sharp enough to manage investment portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But perhaps the most infuriating part of that conversation was what came next. Jessica, sweet and well-meaning Jessica, suggested that David might want to look into support services for elderly people with cognitive decline. There were programs, she said, that could provide professional care and social interaction for people in my supposed condition. "I've looked into that stuff," David replied, and I could hear the false weariness in his voice. "The problem is that it's all really expensive, and Mom's finances are pretty limited. She's got Social Security and a small pension, but it's not enough to cover professional care. And honestly, I'm not sure she'd be comfortable with strangers anyway. She's better off here where I can keep an eye on her." Limited finances, Social Security, and a small pension. I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing out loud at the audacity of it. The man who was describing my supposedly meager resources was sitting in a kitchen that had been renovated with money from my European stock portfolio, drinking coffee made with a machine I had purchased through a shell company based in Delaware, planning a weekend vacation to a resort that would be paid for with dividends from my pharmaceutical investments. David has become so accustomed to the flow of money into his life that he's convinced himself it originates from his own efforts rather than from external sources he's never bothered to identify. The consulting work that pays his bills comes from companies that have business relationships with firms I control through various investment vehicles. The apartment building where he lived before moving into my house is owned by a real estate company that I acquired through a series of strategic purchases. Even his car payments are automatically debited from an account that receives regular transfers from a trust fund he doesn't know exists. But in David's version of reality, he's a self-made man who has achieved success through his own intelligence and hard work, while simultaneously caring for an elderly mother whose limited resources require his ongoing financial support. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain both of these beliefs simultaneously would be impressive if it weren't so infuriating. The conversation between David and Jessica continued, with her praising him for his dedication to my care and his sacrifice in giving up opportunities to ensure I had the support I needed. David accepted this praise with the kind of humble grace that suggested he truly believed he deserved it, that his minimal and grudging provision of basic survival necessities constituted genuine caregiving worthy of admiration. "It's not easy," he said with a sigh that sounded rehearsed. "Sometimes I wonder what my life would be like if I didn't have these responsibilities. But she's my mother, you know? She took care of me when I was young, so now it's my turn to take care of her." She took care of me when I was young. The understatement was so vast that I felt dizzy contemplating its scope. I didn't just take care of David when he was young. I built and maintained an entire financial empire specifically to ensure that every need he would ever have could be met without him having to worry about practical concerns like earning money, or managing expenses, or planning for the future. I created scholarship programs that funded his education while making it appear that he had earned merit-based assistance. I purchased properties that he was able to rent at below-market rates while believing he had found exceptional deals through his own apartment hunting skills. I established business relationships that led to consulting opportunities that provided him with steady income while requiring minimal actual work output. The life David is living, the comfort and security and freedom from financial stress that he takes for granted exists because I have spent decades carefully orchestrating every aspect of his economic environment. The idea that he is now taking care of me by providing substandard food and subhuman living conditions is so grotesquely inverted that it defies rational comprehension. But the most disturbing aspect of his conversation with Jessica wasn't his lies about my mental condition or his fabrications about our financial situation. It was the genuine conviction in his voice when he described himself as a devoted son making sacrifices for his mother's well-being. David has convinced himself that his story is true, that his actions are justified, that his treatment of me is not just acceptable, but admirable. This level of self-deception requires a fundamental disconnection from reality that goes beyond simple greed or selfishness. David has constructed an alternate universe where he is the hero of our story, where his comfort comes from his own efforts, where my suffering is either necessary or exaggerated, or possibly even beneficial for my own good. After Jessica left that evening, I lay in the darkness, listening to David move around the house above me, and I realized that my situation had moved beyond mere elder abuse or financial exploitation. This was something more complex and more dangerous, a complete inversion of reality so thorough that David might actually be incapable of recognizing the truth even when it was presented to him directly. That realization crystallized something that had been building in my mind for weeks. The time for subtle interventions or gradual corrections had passed. David's disconnect from reality was too complete, his sense of entitlement too deeply ingrained, his capacity for self-deception too sophisticated to be addressed through conventional means. The lesson I was going to teach him would need to be proportional to the scale of his delusions. It would need to be dramatic enough to penetrate the elaborate fiction he had constructed about our relationship and his role in our family. It would need to be comprehensive enough to address not just his current behavior, but the decades of assumptions and expectations that had led to this moment. Most importantly, it would need to be educational rather than merely punitive. The goal wasn't to destroy David's life, but to force him to confront the reality of his circumstances, to understand the true source of his advantages, and to develop the kind of gratitude and humility that should have been cultivated years earlier. But planning such a lesson from my current position required resources and capabilities that seemed impossible to access. I was trapped in a crawlspace with no independent means of communication, no access to my financial accounts, and no ability to contact the people who could help me implement the kind of comprehensive response that David's behavior warranted. Or so I thought, until I remembered the emergency protocols I had established decades earlier, back when I first began accumulating significant wealth and realized I might someday need ways to access my resources under extraordinary circumstances. Hidden in the foundation of this house, beneath a section of concrete that appears identical to the rest of the floor, is a waterproof container that holds items I hoped I would never need to use. Emergency cash in several currencies, backup identification documents, contact information for financial institutions and legal representatives who have been instructed to respond to specific code phrases, and access credentials for accounts that exist entirely outside the normal financial systems David has been manipulating. The container has been there for over 20 years, updated periodically during times when I could access it without detection, waiting for a crisis that I hoped would never come. The irony that such a crisis would involve my own son rather than external threats was not something I had anticipated, but the preparations I had made were just as relevant regardless of the source of the emergency. Accessing the container required waiting for the right opportunity, when David would be away from the house long enough for me to break through the concrete seal, retrieve what I needed, and begin implementing the protocols I had established for exactly this kind of situation. That opportunity came sooner than I expected. David announced that he and Jessica were taking a long weekend trip to a resort in the mountains, leaving Thursday evening and returning Monday morning. 4 days of complete privacy, more than enough time to execute the preliminary steps of what I was beginning to think of as David's education in gratitude and humility. The night they left, I waited until I was certain they were well away from the house before beginning the delicate process of accessing my emergency resources. My concrete seal came away more easily than I had expected, revealing the waterproof container exactly where I had left it 2 decades earlier. Inside were documents that represented access to financial resources David couldn't begin to imagine. Account numbers for banks in Switzerland, Singapore, and the Cayman Islands. Contact information for law firms that specialized in complex financial structures and confidential transactions. Authorization codes for trust funds that had been generating compound returns for decades without any external oversight or management. But the most important item in the container was a secure satellite communication device that could connect me directly to people who had been waiting years for instructions about how to proceed if I ever needed to activate the more dramatic aspects of my financial planning. The first call I made was to Margaret Steinberg, a lawyer who had been managing certain aspects of my investments since David was in elementary school. Margaret's firm specialized in complex financial structures for high-net-worth individuals who needed to maintain privacy and flexibility in their asset management. "Mrs. Griffin," Margaret said when the secure connection was established, "I wasn't sure I would ever receive this call. Are you ready to proceed with the protocols we discussed?" "I'm ready," I replied, and even saying those words felt like crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. "Initiate Phase 1 of the revelation sequence. I want everything documented and prepared for implementation beginning Monday morning." "Understood," Margaret said. "And the scope of the revelation? Are we proceeding with the complete disclosure package?" I paused, thinking about David sleeping comfortably in a luxury resort room paid for with money from my pharmaceutical stock. Dividends, while I sat on concrete in a moldy crawlspace planning the end of his carefully constructed fantasy world. "Complete disclosure," I confirmed. "I want him to understand exactly what he's been living off of, exactly how long it's been going on, and exactly what his treatment of me is going to cost him going forward." The next 3 days were a whirlwind of secure communications and financial maneuvers that I had been preparing for decades, but never expected to actually implement. Margaret's team worked around the clock to prepare documentation that would reveal the full scope of my wealth and the extent to which David's lifestyle had been subsidized without his knowledge. Bank statements going back 15 years, showing regular transfers that had funded everything from his rent to his car payments to his vacation expenses. Corporate documents revealing that the consulting company that provided his primary income was a subsidiary of a firm I owned outright. Property records showing that I held the mortgages on every apartment he had ever lived in, and that his monthly payments had been significantly below market rate due to arrangements I had made with property management companies. But the most devastating documentation was the comprehensive analysis of David's actual earning capacity versus his spending patterns. The numbers revealed that without my hidden subsidies, David's lifestyle would have been unsustainable within 6 months of his college graduation. Every advantage he thought he had earned, every opportunity he believed he had created, every comfort he assumed was the result of his own capabilities had been purchased with money from accounts he didn't know existed. Margaret's team also prepared what we called the correction package, a set of financial adjustments that would bring David's circumstances in line with what they would have been if he had been truly independent throughout his adult life. Elimination of all subsidies, termination of artificial consulting contracts, adjustment of rental arrangements to market rates, and cessation of all indirect financial support that had been flowing to him through various channels. The correction package was designed not to impoverish David, but to give him an accurate understanding of his actual financial position without the support system he had never recognized or appreciated. It would be educational rather than punitive, enlightening rather than devastating, though I suspected David would have difficulty appreciating that distinction initially. But before implementing any financial adjustments, I wanted David to understand exactly what he had been living off of and exactly how his treatment of me factored into the new arrangements that would govern our relationship going forward. On now. Sunday evening, as David and Jessica were presumably enjoying their last night at the resort, I made my final preparations for what I had begun to think of as Revelation Day. The documentation was complete, the financial structures were in place, and the legal frameworks were established to ensure that everything would proceed according to plan, regardless of David's reaction. I had also made arrangements for my own immediate relocation to more appropriate accommodations. A luxury apartment in one of the city's most exclusive buildings, fully furnished and staffed, where I could recover from my months in the crawlspace. While overseeing David's transition to financial reality, the apartment came with medical staff who could address the health issues I had developed during my time in the crawlspace, personal assistants who could help me reestablish the lifestyle I had been maintaining in secret for decades, and security. Personnel who could ensure that David's reaction to his new circumstances didn't pose any risk to my well-being. By Monday morning, everything was in place for the most expensive lesson in humility and gratitude that any ungrateful child had ever received. David would return from his weekend vacation to discover that the woman he had been treating like a burdensome dependent was actually the source of every advantage he had ever enjoyed, and that his future comfort would depend entirely on his ability to demonstrate the kind of respect and appreciation that should have been forthcoming years earlier. The anticipation was almost overwhelming. After months of lying in darkness listening to David enjoy the fruits of my labor while treating me like a burden to be hidden away, I was finally going to reveal the truth about our relationship and his circumstances. The foundation beneath me was solid concrete, poured decades ago to last for generations. But foundations can shift when the weight distribution above them changes dramatically, and David was about to learn that the entire structure of his life had been resting on support he had never bothered to examine or acknowledge. The lesson was about to begin, and it was going to be worth every penny. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that makes everything seem sharper, more defined, more real. I could hear David's car pulling into the driveway at exactly 9:37. The sound of gravel crunching under tires marking the beginning of what would be the most transformative day of his life, though he had no way of knowing it yet. From my position in the crawlspace, I listened to him and Jessica entering through the front door, their voices carrying the relaxed happiness of people returning from a pleasant vacation. They were discussing their weekend, laughing about inside jokes, making plans for dinner later in the week. The casual intimacy of their conversation was a stark reminder of the normal life happening above my head while I existed in this subterranean exile. "I should probably check on Mom," David said, and I could hear the performative concern in his voice, the way he emphasized his supposed caregiving responsibilities for Jessica's benefit. "Make sure she's okay, see if she needs anything." But instead of coming down to the crawlspace, I heard his footsteps heading toward the kitchen, followed by the sound of the refrigerator opening and closing. He was checking to see if any of the food he had left for me was missing, a cursory inspection that would tell him whether I was still alive without requiring any actual interaction or genuine concern for my well-being. What David didn't know was that Margaret Steinberg and her team had been busy throughout the weekend, implementing the preliminary phases of what we had designed as a comprehensive educational experience. By the time David was settling back into his routine, documents were already being prepared for delivery, financial structures were being adjusted, and legal notifications were being drafted that would fundamentally alter his understanding of reality. At precisely 10 o'clock, the first surprise arrived. I heard the doorbell ring, followed by David's footsteps as he went to answer it. The conversation at the front door was brief and professional, the kind of exchange that happens when someone receives an unexpected delivery requiring a signature. "David Griffin?" I heard an unfamiliar voice ask. "Yes, that's me," David replied, and I could detect a note of curiosity in his tone. "I have a package for you from the law offices of Steinberg, Walsh & Associates. I need you to sign here, please." There was a moment of silence, and I could picture David examining the envelope, trying to determine what kind of legal document might be arriving at his doorstep on a Monday morning. Law firms don't typically send packages to people who aren't expecting them, and the timing of this delivery was clearly causing him some concern. "Is this about some kind of lawsuit or something?" David asked, and the worry in his voice was unmistakable. "I'm just the courier, sir," the delivery person replied. "I don't have any information about the contents." After the courier left, I heard David closing the front door and walking back toward the kitchen, where Jessica was apparently making coffee. The sound of paper tearing told me he was opening the envelope, and I found myself holding my breath, in anticipation of his reaction to what he would find inside. The first document in the package was a letter from Margaret Steinberg, written in the formal language that lawyers use when they want to convey serious information without revealing too much detail. The letter informed David that he was the beneficiary of certain financial arrangements that had been supporting his lifestyle for an extended period, and that changes to these arrangements would be taking effect immediately. But the letter was deliberately vague about the specifics, designed to create questions rather than provide answers. It instructed David to attend a meeting at Margaret's office at 2 o'clock that afternoon, where he would receive a comprehensive briefing about his financial situation and the adjustments that would be implemented going forward. "What the hell is this supposed to mean?" David said, and I could hear the confusion and growing anxiety in his voice as he read the letter aloud to Jessica. Jessica's response was equally puzzled. "Financial arrangements that have been supporting your lifestyle? What kind of arrangements? Do you have some kind of trust fund or something that you never mentioned?" "No," David said, and the certainty in his voice would have been touching if it weren't so completely wrong. "I don't have any trust funds or family money or anything like that. My mom's broke, remember? That's why she's living here instead of in some fancy retirement community." The irony of that statement was so perfect that I had to press my hand over my mouth to keep from laughing out loud. David was standing in a kitchen that had been renovated with money from my European investment portfolio, discussing his supposedly impoverished mother with a woman who was drinking coffee made with water filtered through a system I had purchased, while the two of them tried to puzzle out the source of financial support that had been flowing to him for over a decade. "Maybe it's from your father's side of the family," Jessica suggested. "Didn't you say your parents got divorced when you were little? Maybe your dad set something up before he died?" "My dad didn't have any money either," David replied, though his voice carried less certainty now. "And besides, he died in a car accident when I was 18. If there had been some kind of inheritance or insurance policy, I would have known about it years ago." I could hear paper rustling as David examined the other documents in the package, trying to find clues that would help him understand what was happening. But Margaret had been careful to include only enough information to establish the reality of the situation without providing details that would allow David to prepare psychologically for what he was about to learn. "This is probably just some kind of scam," David said finally, though his tone suggested he didn't entirely believe his own words. "You know how these lawyers work. They send out official-looking documents to try to get people to pay for services they don't need." But Jessica was reading the letter more carefully, and her response carried a note of concern that David's dismissive explanation couldn't address. "David, this isn't asking you to pay for anything. It's saying that money has been going to you, and that it's going to stop. That doesn't sound like a scam, that sounds like something you need to take seriously." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with David alternating between dismissive confidence and growing worry as he tried to rationalize what he was reading. He called the law firm to verify that the documents were legitimate, and the receptionist confirmed that yes, Mr. Griffin was expected for a 2 o'clock appointment, and yes, the meeting was regarding financial arrangements that had been supporting his lifestyle. By the time David hung up the phone, his voice had lost most of its confident dismissiveness and taken on the tight quality that people develop when they're trying not to panic. "I guess I have to go to this meeting," he said to Jessica. "But I still don't understand what any of this is supposed to be about." "Do you want me to come with you?" Jessica offered, and I could hear the genuine concern in her voice. "No," David said quickly. "I mean, thanks, but this is probably just some administrative thing that got mixed up. I'll go sort it out and be back in a couple of hours." After David left for his appointment, Jessica remained in the house, and I could hear her moving around upstairs, occasionally talking on the phone to friends about David's mysterious legal meeting. Her presence meant I couldn't emerge from the crawlspace to begin my own preparations for the afternoon's revelations. But I used the time to review the comprehensive documentation that Margaret's team had prepared. The materials that David would receive during his meeting were designed to provide a complete picture of his financial dependency, presented in a format that would be impossible to deny or rationalize away. Bank records showing the source and timing of every payment that had supported his lifestyle. Corporate documents revealing the true ownership structure of the companies that had employed him. Property records demonstrating that his housing had been subsidized through arrangements he had never suspected. But the most devastating component of the revelation would be the detailed financial analysis showing exactly how much money had flowed to David over the years, and what his actual net worth would be if those subsidies were removed retroactively. The numbers were staggering, even to me, and I had been the one authorizing the payments all along. Conservative estimates suggested that David had received over $2 million in direct and indirect support since graduating from college. Money that had funded everything from his basic living expenses to his luxury purchases to his vacation travel. Without that support, his modest consulting income would have left him living in a studio apartment, driving a used car, and forgoing most of the lifestyle elements he had come to consider normal. The revelation was designed not just to inform David about his circumstances, but to force him to confront the magnitude of his ingratitude and the cruelty of his treatment toward the woman who had been secretly funding his comfortable existence. Margaret had prepared a comprehensive presentation that would walk David through every financial transaction, every subsidized opportunity, every hidden advantage that had shaped his adult life. At exactly 4 o'clock, I heard David's car returning to the driveway, but the sound was different this time. Instead of the confident acceleration of someone returning from a routine errand, I heard the hesitant, slower approach of someone who was driving in a state of shock. The front door opened and closed with unusual quietness, and David's footsteps across the hardwood floor sounded heavy and uncertain. When Jessica called out to him from the kitchen, asking how the meeting had gone, his response was a long moment of silence followed by a voice I barely recognized. "Jessica," he said, and the words seemed to require tremendous effort. "I think we need to talk." What followed was the most surreal conversation I had ever heard, as David attempted to explain to his girlfriend something that he clearly didn't fully understand himself. His voice carried the hollow quality of someone who had been forced to confront the complete inadequacy of their understanding of reality. "The lawyer," he began, then stopped and started again. "There's this lawyer, and she had all these documents, and apparently my mother." Another pause, longer this time. "Apparently my mother has been giving me money for years without telling me." Jessica's response was immediate and practical. "What kind of money? How much money?" "A lot of money," David said, and I could hear him moving around the kitchen, probably pacing as he tried to process what he had learned. "Like, all of my money. Everything I thought I was earning, everything I thought I had accomplished, it was all coming from her somehow." "But that doesn't make sense," Jessica said, and I could hear the confusion in her voice. "You said your mother was broke, that she was living here because she couldn't afford her own place." "I know what I said," David replied, and his tone was sharp with frustration and disbelief. "But apparently I was wrong. Apparently I've been wrong about everything." The conversation continued, with David attempting to explain the revelation in fragments and partial sentences, clearly struggling to articulate something that challenged his fundamental understanding of his own life. He told Jessica about the bank records that showed regular transfers funding his rent payments, about the corporate documents revealing that his consulting contracts were arranged rather than earned, about the property records showing that his mother owned the building where he had lived for 3 years. "But if your mother has all this money," Jessica said slowly, "why is she living in your basement? Why have you been talking about her like she's some kind of burden you're taking care of?" That question hung in the air like a physical presence, and I found myself waiting breathlessly for David's response. This was the moment when he would have to confront not just the reality of his financial dependency, but the moral implications of how he had been treating the woman who had been secretly supporting him all along. When David finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know," he said. "I don't understand any of this." But understanding was coming, whether David was ready for it or not. At precisely 5 o'clock, the doorbell rang again, and I heard the same courier from that morning delivering another package. This one was addressed to Jessica, and it contained documents that would help her understand her role in the situation that was unfolding. The package included a detailed explanation of David's true financial circumstances, along with information about how his relationship with Jessica had been indirectly subsidized through arrangements she had never suspected. The romantic dinners, the weekend getaways, the gifts and experiences that David had presented as evidence of his success and generosity had all been funded through accounts that received regular transfers from a trust fund controlled by the woman currently living in the crawlspace beneath their feet. Jessica's reaction to this information was immediate and visceral. I could hear her voice rising in pitch and volume as she read through the documents, her questions becoming accusations as she began to understand the extent to which she had been deceived about David's circumstances. "You told me your mother was mentally declining," she said, and the anger in her voice was unmistakable. "You told me she couldn't take care of herself, that you were sacrificing to provide for her. But she's been paying for everything? She's been paying for our dinners, our trips, this entire relationship?" David's response was a series of stammered attempts at explanation, but there was no explanation that could rationalize the magnitude of the deception he had been living. He had accepted Jessica's sympathy for his supposed sacrifices, while simultaneously accepting financial support from the woman he was portraying as a burden. He had presented himself as successful and independent, while living entirely off money provided by the mother he was keeping locked in a crawlspace. "Where is she?" Jessica demanded, and I could hear her footsteps moving through the house. "Where is your mother right now?" "She's downstairs," David said reluctantly. "She has her own space in the basement area." "Show me," Jessica said, and her tone carried a authority that suggested this was not a request, but a demand. I heard footsteps approaching the kitchen door that led to the crawlspace, and I knew that my months of hidden exile were about to come to an end. But instead of relief, I felt a strange sense of anticipation, as if the most important part of the lesson was just beginning. The door at the top of the ladder opened, and light flooded down into the crawlspace for the first time in weeks. I heard Jessica's sharp intake of breath as she saw the conditions where I had been living, followed by a string of profanity that would have been impressive under other circumstances. "David?" she called up from the ladder, and her voice carried a note of horror that was deeply satisfying. "David, you need to see this. You need to see what you've done." But David didn't come down. Instead, I heard his voice from the kitchen, above, weak and defensive. "She's fine down there. She has everything she needs." "Everything she needs?" Jessica's voice was climbing toward a shout. "She's living on a mattress on a concrete floor surrounded by mold and insects. This isn't care. This is abuse." The word hung in the air like an indictment, and I knew that David was finally being forced to confront the reality of what he had done. Not the sanitized version he had created for himself and others, not the rationalized narrative about providing care for a difficult elderly parent, but the brutal truth about imprisoning the woman who had been secretly funding his lifestyle for over a decade. "Mrs. Griffin?" Jessica called down to me, and her voice was gentle now, filled with the kind of concern that I hadn't heard directed toward me in months. "Are you okay? Can you hear me?" "I can hear you, dear," I replied, and my voice was stronger than it had been in weeks. "And yes, I'm going to be just fine." But I didn't climb the ladder immediately. Instead, I reached for the satellite phone that had been my connection to the outside world during David's vacation, and I made one final call to Margaret Steinberg. "It's time for phase 2, I said when she answered. "Implement the full correction. Package and arrange for my transportation to the new apartment. The educational portion of this experience is about to begin." Within an hour, my life changed completely. A medical team arrived to assess my health and provide immediate treatment for the effects of living in toxic conditions for months. A moving crew appeared to collect the few personal belongings I wanted to retain from the house. A luxury car, with a professional driver, waited to transport me to accommodations that were more appropriate for someone with my actual financial resources. But perhaps most importantly, a team of accountants and lawyers arrived to begin the process of adjusting David's financial arrangements to reflect his actual earning capacity, rather than the subsidized lifestyle he had been enjoying without acknowledgement or gratitude. As I climbed the ladder out of the crawl space for the last time, I could see David standing in the kitchen doorway, his face pale and his expression showing the kind of shock that comes from having your entire understanding of reality overturned in a single afternoon. "Mom," he said, and the words sounded strange coming from someone who had been treating me like a burden for months. "I didn't know. I never realized that you were." "That I was what, David?" I asked, and I kept my voice level and calm despite the rage that had been building inside me for months. "That I was the source of every advantage you've enjoyed since college? That I was the reason you could afford to live in apartments you couldn't pay for, drive cars you couldn't finance, and take vacations you couldn't afford? That I was funding the lifestyle that allowed you to present yourself as successful and independent while treating me like a dependent burden?" David's mouth opened and closed without producing any sound, and I could see him struggling to find words that would explain or excuse or rationalize what he had done. But there were no such words, and we both knew it. "The checks stop now," I continued, and each word was delivered with the precision of a surgical instrument. "All of them. The consulting contracts that were arranged for you, the subsidized housing, the credit lines that were guaranteed by accounts you didn't know existed, all of it ends today." "But Mom," David said, and his voice carried a note of panic that was deeply satisfying. "If you cut me off, I won't be able to afford." "You won't be able to afford the lifestyle you've been living," I finished for him. "You'll be able to afford exactly what your own earnings can support, which is significantly less than what you've become accustomed to receiving." Jessica was standing beside David, and I could see her looking back and forth between us as she tried to process the magnitude of what was being revealed. Her relationship with David had been built on assumptions about his character and capabilities that were proving to be completely false, and I could see her beginning to understand the implications of that deception. "Mrs. Griffin," she said, "carefully, how long has this been going on? How long have you been supporting David without him knowing?" "Since he graduated from college," I replied. 15 years of subsidizing his lifestyle, while he convinced himself that his comfort was the result of his own abilities rather than his mother's generosity. The number seemed to hit David like a physical blow, and I watched him sink into one of the kitchen chairs as the full scope of his dependency became clear to him. 15 years of living a lie, 15 years of accepting advantages he never earned, 15 years of treating the source of his security as a burden to be managed and minimized. "But why didn't you tell me?" he asked, and there was genuine confusion in his voice alongside the panic. "Why didn't you let me know that you were helping me?" "Because I wanted you to develop your own sense of responsibility and work ethic," I said. "I wanted you to appreciate the value of effort and achievement. I wanted you to become the kind of man who would be grateful for advantages rather than entitled to them." "And instead," Jessica said quietly, "he became the kind of man who would put his mother in a crawl space while living off her money." The silence that followed that observation was profound and uncomfortable, broken only by the sound of David's labored breathing as he tried to process the complete reversal of everything. He thought he knew about his life and circumstances, but the revelation was only the beginning of David's education. The real lesson would come in the days and weeks that followed, as he discovered what his life looked like without the hidden support system he had never bothered to acknowledge or appreciate. The foundation of his existence had shifted, and everything built on top of it was about to change accordingly. 3 months have passed since I climbed out of that crawl space, and the transformation in both our lives has been nothing short of extraordinary. I'm sitting now in the penthouse apartment that overlooks the city, my health fully restored, my dignity reclaimed, and my faith in justice partially renewed. The view from these floor-to-ceiling windows encompasses the entire metropolitan area, including the neighborhood where David is learning to live within his actual means for the first time in his adult life. The apartment itself is a testament to what my real financial situation can provide when I'm not hiding it from the world. marble floors that warm my aging feet, a kitchen equipped with appliances that cost more than most people's cars, artwork that museums would covet, and a staff that ensures every comfort I could desire. The contrast with my former living conditions is so stark that sometimes I feel like I'm living in a different universe entirely. My personal physician, Dr. Chen, visits twice weekly to monitor my recovery from the health issues I developed during my time in that toxic environment. The respiratory problems have cleared up completely with proper medical treatment and clean air. The circulation issues in my legs have resolved with physical therapy and regular movement. The depression that had been weighing on me like a lead blanket has lifted with the restoration of my autonomy and dignity. But perhaps the most significant change has been psychological rather than physical. For the first time in years, I feel like myself again. Not the diminished version of myself that David had convinced me I was becoming, not the burden that required management and containment, but Pamela Griffin in all her complexity and capability. David's adjustment to his new circumstances has been considerably more challenging. The correction package that Margaret's team implemented was comprehensive and immediate, removing all the hidden subsidies that had been supporting his lifestyle, while providing him with a clear accounting of what his actual earning capacity could sustain. The consulting contracts that had been providing his primary income were terminated, since they had been arranged through companies I controlled rather than earned through his professional capabilities. The below-market rent he had been paying for his various apartments was adjusted to reflect actual market rates, which meant he could no longer afford to live in the upscale neighborhoods he had become accustomed to inhabiting. The credit lines that had been guaranteed by accounts he didn't know existed were closed, leaving him with access only to credit that his actual income and credit history could support. The car payments that had been automatically debited from a trust fund account were transferred to his personal responsibility, along with insurance costs and maintenance expenses that had previously been managed through financial structures he had never examined. Within 2 weeks of the revelation, David was forced to move out of my house and into a studio apartment in a neighborhood he had always considered beneath his standards. The apartment is clean and safe, but it represents a dramatic downsizing from the spacious, well-appointed homes he had been living in with my subsidization. His transportation situation required similar adjustments. The luxury sedan he had been driving was repossessed when the payments reverted to his responsibility, and his income proved insufficient to maintain the obligations. He now drives a used compact car with high mileage and cosmetic issues that remind him daily of the difference between his assumed prosperity and his actual financial reality. But perhaps the most educational aspect of David's new circumstances has been his discovery of what employment opportunities are actually available to someone with his qualifications and work history. Without the network of business relationships I had cultivated to create opportunities for him, David found himself competing in an open job market for the first time since college graduation. The reality of that competition was sobering. His resume, which had looked impressive when supported by arranged consulting contracts and artificial references, proved much less compelling to employers who were evaluating him solely on his demonstrable skills and achievements. The gaps in his actual experience became obvious when he was asked to provide specific examples of projects he had managed or problems he had solved independently. After 6 weeks of unsuccessful job searching, David finally secured employment as an administrative assistant at a mid-sized accounting firm. The position pays approximately 40% of what he had been receiving through his subsidized consulting work, and the responsibilities are routine and unglamorous compared to the important-sounding projects he had been assigned through my network connections. The adjustment to this new reality has been psychologically devastating for David, though I would argue that it's also been necessary and ultimately beneficial. For the first time in his adult life, he's experiencing the anxiety that most people feel about money, the careful budgeting that people without safety nets must practice, and the genuine appreciation for steady employment that comes from understanding how difficult it can be to secure and maintain. Jessica's departure from his life was swift and decisive. Once she understood the full scope of the deception, David, had been living both in terms of his financial dependency and his treatment of me, she ended their relationship immediately. Her final conversation with David, which I'm told was conducted in the parking lot of his new apartment building, included observations about his character that were harsh, but accurate. Jessica had been attracted to David's apparent success and independence, qualities that proved to be illusions built on foundations he had never bothered to examine. When those illusions collapsed, what remained was a 37-year-old man who had never developed the fundamental life skills that most people acquire in their 20s, and whose capacity for gratitude had been stunted by decades of unacknowledged advantage. The loss of Jessica was perhaps more devastating to David than the financial adjustments, because it forced him to confront the personal rather than just the practical consequences of his behavior. He had genuinely cared for her, and her revulsion at his treatment of me provided a mirror that reflected his actions from an outside perspective for the first time. But while David was struggling with the collapse of his comfortable assumptions about life, I was rediscovering pleasures that I had forgotten during my years of self-imposed modesty. The freedom to make decisions based on preference rather than financial constraint. The luxury of surrounding myself with beautiful things, without worrying about the cost. The satisfaction of being able to help others from a position of strength, rather than pretending to need help myself. I've established a foundation focused on elder abuse prevention, funding research and support services for elderly people who find themselves in situations similar to what I experienced. The irony of becoming an advocate for elder abuse victims, while being one of the wealthiest women in the country, is not lost on me. But it feels like an appropriate use of resources that had been hidden for too long. The Foundation's first major initiative is a program that provides financial literacy education and legal support for elderly people whose adult children are attempting to manipulate or control their resources. Too many families include dynamics similar to what developed between David and me, and too many elderly parents find themselves trapped in situations where their own generosity is used against them. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of my new life has been reconnecting with parts of myself that I had suppressed during my years of deliberate obscurity. I've begun attending social events again, not as Pam Griffin, the struggling single mother, but as Pamela Whitmore Griffin, a woman with opinions and resources and the confidence to express both without apology. The transition hasn't been entirely smooth. Decades of hiding my true circumstances created habits of mind that were difficult to break. I still find myself checking prices automatically, still calculate costs and benefits with the precision of someone who had to make every dollar count, still feel guilty sometimes about spending money on luxuries that represent tiny fractions of my actual wealth. But I'm learning to inhabit my authentic self again, to make decisions from a position of genuine choice rather than artificial constraint. The woman who was raised in privilege, who built a fortune through intelligence and determination, who maintained that fortune through decades of careful management while creating opportunities for an ungrateful child, deserves to enjoy the fruits of her efforts without shame or apology. 6 weeks after his world collapsed, David requested a meeting with me. The request came through Margaret's office, since he no longer had direct access to my contact information, and it was formally worded in a way that suggested he understood the fundamental shift in our relationship dynamics. The meeting took place in Margaret's conference room, a neutral space that emphasized the legal and financial nature of our new arrangements while providing witnesses to whatever conversation might unfold. David arrived exactly on time, dressed in the kind of inexpensive business attire that people wear when they're trying to look professional on a limited budget. The change in his appearance was striking. 3 months of financial stress had aged him in ways that years of comfortable living had not. His face was thinner, his posture less confident, his entire demeanor carrying the weight of someone who had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about himself and his circumstances. When he spoke, his voice carried a humility I had never heard from him before. Gone was the casual entitlement, the assumption that his needs would be met without question, the dismissive tone he had used when discussing my well-being. What remained? was a man who had been stripped of his illusions and was trying to figure out how to rebuild his life on more honest foundations. "Mom," he began, and the words sounded different coming from him now, weighted with meanings it had never carried before. "I came here to apologize, but I know that's not enough. What I did to you, how I treated you, it's unforgivable. The silence stretched between us, not out of cruelty, but because I wanted to hear what else he had to say. Apologies are easy when people are desperate, but understanding requires something deeper than regret for consequences. I've been thinking about everything," he continued, "trying to understand how I could have been so blind, so ungrateful, so cruel to the person who had been taking care of me my entire life. And I think the worst part is that I genuinely believed I was the one taking care of you." That acknowledgement was significant because it suggested David was beginning to understand the magnitude of his self-deception rather than simply regretting the outcomes of his behavior. True change requires recognizing the thought patterns that led to harmful actions, not just feeling sorry about the results. "I know I don't have the right to ask for anything from you," David went on, "and I'm not here to request money or help with my situation. I'm here because I need you to know that I understand what I did, and I need to know if there's any possibility that someday you might be able to forgive me." The question hung in the air between us, and I could see Margaret watching both of us carefully, ready to intervene if the conversation became too emotional or confrontational. But I felt remarkably calm, centered in a way I hadn't experienced in years. "David," I said finally, "forgiveness isn't something you can request, or that I can simply decide to grant. It's something that develops over time, based on evidence of genuine change rather than expressions of remorse." He nodded, and I could see that he was fighting back tears. "I understand. I just needed you to know that I'm trying to become the kind of person who deserves forgiveness, even if I never actually receive it." That response suggested a level of self-awareness that was encouraging, though I remained skeptical about its durability. People in crisis often develop insights that disappear when their circumstances improve, and David's current humility might evaporate if his financial situation stabilized. "Tell me about your life now," I said. "How are you managing with your new circumstances?" David's description of his daily reality was both heartbreaking and educational. He talked about learning to budget for groceries, about taking public transportation because he couldn't afford parking, about sharing his studio apartment with a roommate to split the rent. He described the anxiety of not knowing whether he would be able to meet his monthly obligations, the constant calculations required to make his paycheck stretch until the next one arrived. But he also talked about discoveries he had made during this period of enforced simplicity. The satisfaction of cooking his own meals instead of ordering takeout constantly. The way financial constraints had forced him to be more creative about entertainment and social activities. The unexpected pleasure of having genuine friendships with people who valued his company rather than his ability to pay for expensive outings. "I never understood," he said, "how much effort most people put into just surviving, how much stress they carry about basic things like rent and utilities and medical bills. I thought I was working hard, but I was playing a game where the rules were rigged in my favor and I didn't even know it." That insight was particularly significant, because it suggested David was beginning to develop the kind of empathy that comes from shared experience rather than abstract sympathy. Understanding struggle intellectually is very different from living it, and his newfound appreciation for ordinary people's challenges might create lasting changes in his character. As our conversation continued, I found myself cautiously optimistic about David's prospects for genuine growth. The spoiled, entitled man who had locked me in a crawlspace was being replaced by someone who was learning to value effort, appreciate assistance, and recognize the humanity in people he had previously dismissed as beneath his consideration. But I also made it clear that any future relationship between us would be built on completely different terms than our previous dynamic. There would be no return to the hidden subsidies, no secret support systems, no safety nets that allowed him to take risks without facing consequences. If David wanted to rebuild his life, he would do it through his own efforts, with the same challenges and uncertainties that most people face. "I'm proud of you for taking responsibility," I told him as our meeting concluded. "And I'm hopeful that this experience will help you become the man I always wanted you to be. But earning back my trust and respect will take time, and it will require consistent evidence of change rather than promises about future behavior." David accepted these conditions without argument, and I could see that he understood the justice of my position. He had betrayed not just my trust, but my love, and rebuilding those connections would require more than apologies and good intentions. Since that meeting, David and I have maintained limited contact, primarily through brief emails where he updates me about his life and work. The updates are modest but encouraging. He's received a small promotion at his job, moving from administrative assistant to junior accountant, with a corresponding increase in salary that allows him slightly more financial breathing room. He's also begun volunteering at a community center that provides services for elderly residents, working with people who face many of the same challenges I endured during my time in the Crawlspace. The irony of this choice is profound, but the work seems to be providing him with perspective on elder abuse and neglect that he couldn't have gained through any other experience. Most significantly, David has begun attending therapy sessions focused on understanding and changing the thought patterns that led to his entitled behavior. This was his own initiative rather than a requirement I imposed, which suggests he's taking genuine responsibility for his personal growth rather than simply trying to manipulate his way back into my good graces. As for me, I'm learning to enjoy my restored life while carrying the wisdom that comes from having experienced both extreme wealth and utter powerlessness. The months in that crawl space were among the worst of my life, but they also taught me things about resilience, about the corrupting effects of unexamined privilege, and about the importance of maintaining connections to reality even when wealth makes it possible to live in carefully constructed fantasies. I've begun reaching out to other members of the Whitmore family, testing whether the decades-old rift that separated me from my original identity might be healed through honest conversation and mutual recognition of how much we've all changed. The responses have been mixed, but several cousins have expressed interest in rebuilding relationships that were severed by decisions made when we were all much younger and less wise. The foundation work has become increasingly meaningful as it's grown in scope and impact. We've helped dozens of elderly people escape exploitative situations, provided legal and financial support for families dealing with complex inheritance, disputes, and funded research that's beginning to change how society understands and responds to elder abuse. But perhaps the most important lesson I've learned through this entire experience is that hiding who you are, even with the best intentions, often creates more problems than it solves. My decision to conceal my wealth from David was motivated by love and a desire to teach him values, but it ultimately enabled his worst impulses while depriving him of the opportunity to develop genuine appreciation for advantages he never knew he was receiving. If I had been honest about our financial circumstances from the beginning, David might have learned to be grateful rather than entitled, responsible rather than dependent, generous rather than selfish. The deception I maintained to protect him from corruption actually corrupted him in different but equally damaging ways. That understanding has shaped how I approach relationships now. I'm honest about my resources and expectations, direct about my boundaries and requirements, transparent about my capabilities and limitations. It's a more vulnerable way to live, but it's also more authentic, and authenticity creates space for genuine connection rather than relationships built on false assumptions. Looking back on the woman who spent months sleeping with cockroaches while her son lived in luxury funded by her own wealth, I feel neither shame nor regret. That experience was necessary for both of us, a brutal but effective education in consequences, and reality that couldn't have been achieved through gentler means. David needed to understand what life looks like without unearned advantages, what effort feels like when it's not cushioned by hidden safety nets, what gratitude means when it's based on genuine appreciation rather than abstract obligation. The lesson was expensive, but education always costs something, and some lessons can only be learned through direct experience. As I sit here now, watching the sunset paint the city in shades of gold and amber, I find myself grateful for everything that led to this moment. The privilege I was born into, the love that led me away from it, the struggles that taught me resilience, the success I built through my own intelligence and determination, even the months of darkness that showed me how precious light really is. David is learning similar lessons through his own journey back toward humanity and humility. Whether he'll succeed in becoming the man he should have been all along remains to be seen, but he's finally walking the right path, and that's more why than I dared hope for during those long nights in the crawlspace when revenge seemed more appealing than redemption. The foundation beneath us all is solid now, built on truth rather than comfortable deceptions, supported by genuine effort rather than hidden subsidies, designed to bear the weight of authentic relationships rather than elaborate pretenses. It's a better foundation than the one we started with, even though building it required tearing down everything we thought we knew about ourselves and each other. Some lessons are worth their cost, no matter how expensive they prove to be. And some truths, once revealed, make everything that follows possible in ways that comfortable lies never could. That's what I've learned from sleeping with cockroaches and living through the most expensive lesson in gratitude that any mother has ever given her child. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.